Hey, this is Language Shrimp, and today we're talking about grammatical case. First, we'll discuss some basics of what case is, how it happens, how common it is, etc. Then we'll start listing as per usual. I'm mostly going to go down the list of common core cases and discuss more unique related cases that are either directly connected to the core case being talked about, or that I could just find enough of a relationship for me to go on a tangent about. Then I'll cover up some more important to know less common cases, then finally talk about some weird case phenomena in general. And at the very, very end, I need to mention a very notable development in the channel. Okay, so I've mentioned grammatical case a lot in other videos because it's a pretty important thing. It's effectively a way for a language to mark the semantic or syntactic role of a noun phrase on the noun phrase itself through morphology. It, along with agreement and word order, is one of the three main ways to mark semantic or syntactic role, and it is the primary tool of the dependent marking system, where the dependent of a phrase is marked to show its relation to the head instead of vice versa. I've mentioned before that for the most part, grammatical case is a grammaticalization of adpositions onto the noun, although I wouldn't say that's definitionally what it is, as there are niche ways to develop certain cases without adpositions. But overall, the way case comes about is through adpositions, specifically postpositions, as case affixes really don't like being prefixes for some reason. Because of this, for each case I talk about, I will be putting somewhere right next to it some English prepositions that generally convey its meaning, or that your language's equivalent adpositions could be used to derive the case. And even if you don't want case in your language, this video can be a great way to see your breadth of options for adpositions in your language. The first important thing to be understood when adding case to your language is the case hierarchy. Essentially, when a language develops case, it will usually develop them in a very specific order. First, it will distinguish the cases directly related to morphosyntactic alignment, usually the nominative and accusative. Then it will develop the genitive, followed by the dative, then locative, then either the ablative or instrumental, then the other between that pairing, then the weirder, more niche cases. Whenever you see a language that seemingly skips steps on the hierarchy, usually there's only a few explanations. One of the core cases is used less generally in this language than it is in others, or multiple cases that cover different facets of the broader core case are used. For example, when the genitive only covers possession, it may be renamed to the possessive case, or the locative, which has tons of subcases, may be represented only by those subcases. The language has hybridized certain cases together, such as the genitive and ergative, so that multiple core case meanings are covered by one broader case, or the language is in a state of losing cases, usually in a transitional period between fusional and analytic grammar, and phonological changes rendered some cases indistinguishable, homophonically merging them in weird ways or making them straight unusable, all of which are ways wholes could develop in the hierarchy. You may also in general notice that all of these core cases are really broad and cover multiple adpositional meanings. So I want to mention here that case never replaces adpositional meaning. There are always ways to convey more specific meanings than is covered by the language's cases, using adpositions or coverbs. Even in languages with crazy high numbers of cases, case conveys common meanings often conveyed by adpositions, but it certainly doesn't replace them. Now, you might see when looking at the wall statistics for case, that there is of course a solid chance of a language not having case, or only having borderline case marking, which I'll get into in a bit. But that whenever you do have case, it's actually a good bit more likely for you to have 6 or more cases than it is for you to have less. And you may also notice that the case hierarchy is composed of 6 or 7 cases, depending on how you count. This is because there's another important thing with case development, just the sheer speed at which it occurs. Languages generally don't waffle around and pick up cases over time. Once they start with case, they develop a bunch all at once, then usually keep them pretty consistent for a relatively long time. This also relates to another issue with case. If languages develop case so often from adpositions, and the accusative case is the first to be marked, then where's the accusative adposition? Why don't languages that don't have case mark their direct objects with adpositions? In English, the word dog and he walked the dog has nothing to indicate that the dog is the object other than word order. And the answer is languages do develop adpositions for direct objects. But because the adposition is so simple, widespread, and useful, and because case on principle develops quickly, once you start seeing an adposition getting used for morphosyntax, it will usually almost immediately affix onto the noun, thus usually triggering the rest of the case hierarchy to follow close behind it. It takes quite a perfect storm of weird grammar for an accusative marker to stay separate. Japanese notably doesn't have an adposition word class, instead covering most complex adpositional meanings through other classes. But it does have a very small set of case particles that pretty solidly correspond to the usual cases. including both its agentive or nominative and patientive or accusative case. But these case particles still don't grammaticize onto the word and thus aren't technically case by the official definition. Meanwhile, Hawaiian also has these case particles, which include an object particle, but it has more prepositions and it's kind of unclear how these case particles should be considered separate. And Hawaiian's nominative is indicated through it being unmarked. This is probably the most directly pre-case system you can get, the only thing stopping affixation here likely being the prepositional nature of these particles. And still yet, some languages like Persian and Spanish use differential object marking, which I'll get into later, so that their objects sometimes have an adposition and sometimes don't. Okay, now to actually start listing. First, there are your cases related to morphosyntactic alignment. I go over extensively the different types of morphosyntactic alignment and the cases associated with them in the video of that title in my syntax series. So here I'll focus mainly on how the common cases develop. It might be a bit hard to understand without watching that vid though, so you can skip to the genitive if you want to watch that first. Firstly, there's the nominative or absolutive case, which I'm grouping together because while they function differently, both are usually the language's default unmarked case. Most of the language's other cases will derive from adpositions affixing onto the noun, but the nominative or absolutive case is just what they call nouns that otherwise don't have case. There are, of course, exceptions to this. When I talked about morphosyntactic alignment, I talked about what I call the S, A, and O arguments, defined in that video. But there's actually a fourth, generally less important one, the object of the adposition. The syntactic role a noun has when it is the object of an adpositional phrase. I'll call this the X argument. Due to the way case works, the objects of adpositions will typically be unmarked, because if it's bound to an adposition in the first place, that means the adposition has an affix to it, meaning it will often go along with the S argument and merging into the nominative or absolutive. The so-called marked nominative system then comes when it doesn't, when the S argument is grouped with the A or O argument, but the X argument is grouped with the other or is handled separately. Which case is actually morphologically more or less marked can vary. Usually, either the nominative case will have derived from an earlier ergative case that in all effects stole the S argument, meaning your nominative case will have derived the same way. These situations usually overlap with various split ergative systems, because they rely on the precedent of the S argument being represented by a marked case, which usually can directly lead to more flexible use of that. Or, another case, namely the accusative, will steal the X argument from the nominative, making it no longer the default. This notably happened in English pronouns, meaning that what we often call our accusative case is actually more of an oblique or objective case, which is the term for that kind of thing, when the X argument isn't marked with the S. As for when the X argument is marked completely on its own, this is often either just slapped again with the oblique case, or it is called the prepositional case. In Scottish Gaelic, this case developed from a repurposing of the dative case, and in Russian, it developed from the locative. Then we have the dynamic duo of accusative and ergative. The accusative will typically derive from adpositions meaning at or to, as the undergoer of the action is easily analyzed as having the action occur directed at their location, or otherwise directionally towards them. Notably, at and to are also adpositions used to develop the locative and dative respectively. However, the accusative usually won't hybridize with them, as these cases have multiple ways to develop. For example, if the adposition at is used to develop the accusative, then the adposition on might be used to develop the locative. Or if the accusative takes 2, then the dative may take 4. As for the ergative, I've mentioned that the ergative absolutive alignment often comes from the passive voice becoming the default voice. And I've also mentioned that the agent of a passive voice sentence will often have its own adposition, and thus the ergative case will usually evolve from these passive adpositions. Hence why the ergative absolutive alignment is so common with case specifically. Now, this can also notably lead to the ergative case hybridizing with other cases, as usually the passive adposition doesn't solely handle passive voice agents. For example, in English, we use the adposition by, which can also be used to fill an adessive or instructive or prolative meaning, like in she sits by the pool and she won the game by cheating, respectively. Other languages might use adpositions meaning things like of or from, which are the adpositions which usually evolve into the genitive and ablative cases respectively. Something like, she was hugged of him, or she was hugged from him, leading the ergative to hybridize with one of those cases. This ergative genitive case occurs in classical Maya and in Iqtitut. Relatedly, even if you don't have an ergative absolutive language, these cases and adpositions are all options for marking the agent of a passive voice sentence in general. Also notably, in conflict with the case hierarchy, Some languages employ borderline case marking, where they only mark non-morphosyntactic cases, meaning the S, A, and O arguments are marked by word order or agreement, but certain adpositional phrases still affix together, usually in an order that follows the rest of the case hierarchy. Now on to the genitive, but first we have to talk about the genitive construction, which I believe I touched on in the basic syntax video, but didn't get deep into. Essentially, the genitive construction is an attempt to show a relation between two nouns, most commonly possession, but there are more than just that. There are multiple ways to show this genitive construction, which I'll get into in later videos, but the most important one for this video, and generally the most common one, is that the genitive itself, the dependent noun that is modifying the other, is often an adpositional phrase. Effectively, this leads to a dichotomy between genitives and obliques, which I also mentioned in my basic syntax vid, where a genitive is effectively an adpositional phrase that is used as a dependent to a noun, along with adjectives and such, and an oblique is an adpositional phrase that is dependent to a verb, along with your usual subjects and objects. Neither of these should be confused with the genitive or oblique cases, which are different concepts. The genitive case is the case mainly used to signify a genitive, but many, if not most, adpositions and cases can be used either as a genitive or oblique. Like in the man from Kentucky walked, from Kentucky is a genitive, while in the man walked from Kentucky, it is an oblique. It is pretty rare for a noun in the genitive case to be used as an oblique. I don't believe it happens in English, but some languages do allow that, such as with it being used for the passive voice in some languages, like I mentioned earlier. So it's not a hard rule. Now, the genitive case has perhaps the widest range of possible applications in most languages, as it also usually takes the role of a general case, where it can describe basically any vague relationship between nouns. Some languages, though, have it apply only to possession, in which case it might be renamed to the possessive case. English, notably, both has the genitive adposition of and a possessive form of all of its nouns. This means that while they do have some overlapping meaning, i.e. the king's crown and the crown of the king, the true genitive can be used for a lot more, like with the house of the rising sun or the wheel of cheese. The rising sun's house and the cheese's wheel just don't carry that general meaning, because our possessive is specifically that, possessive. This general usage is not unique to the genitive, though. Some languages may instead or also give it to the ablative or oblique case. Also, notably due to the weirdness with possession, sometimes you'll get things like the possessed case, where the object that is possessed is the one that gets a case, such as in some Semitic languages. As for how the genitive derives, there is of course the adposition of, which is very common. Notably, even languages that otherwise lack adpositions still usually have what is called the genitive connector, which performs the same meaning. Alternatively, some languages mark possession through what is known as possessive nouns or determiners, where in which each pronoun has a genitive form, and if you want to have a noun be genitive, you have its corresponding possessive pronoun or determiner show up with it. So, instead of the man's dog, or the dog of the man, you have the man his dog. Usually, this is a precursor to possessive agreement, where the possessive pronoun affixes to the head noun to have it agree with the dependent noun, but you may also use these pronouns as an interesting way to evolve case. Relatedly, due to the fact that genitives sort of are like nouns used as adjectives, in that they are used to modify or describe something about a noun, sometimes when a language has adjective agreement, the genitive case will get caught up in this too, in a process called suffix alphonemy, meaning the genitive case now also comes with agreement attached, or the agreement itself may be what marks the genitive case. Sometimes genitives will even agree with the case of other nouns. Next up, we have the dative, which marks the semantic role of recipient or beneficiary, and is comparable to the English to or for. This role of recipient/beneficiary is sometimes described in syntactic terms as the indirect object, as some languages that use primarily word order have a separate word order slot for this role that doesn't require an adposition. Notably, English, where you can say, I got my mother a card, or I got a card from my mother, and I gave the dog a bone, or I gave a bone to the dog. While these roles of recipient and beneficiary are very similar, sometimes they do get handled by different cases. The benefactive case is a version of the dative case without the directional meaning of the recipient's to, specifically being used for. Meanwhile, due to the idea of a recipient sort of having an inherent directionality, sometimes a directional local case, such as the allative or lative, which I'll get into in a sec, may be hybridized with the dative, such as in says and finish. Interestingly, in Armenian, the dative doesn't really have its own case marking, but results from the use of an article alongside a noun in the genitive case. So, of the dog is expressed by something like just of dog, but to/for the dog is expressed by something like of the dog. Then there's the locative, which on its own represents a vague general location, such as at, on, or in. However, a good number of languages go absolutely ham with what are known as local cases, which represent all sorts of different location and direction-based relations a noun can have to a verb. It's these languages, like Finnish, that fall in the 10+ category. Here's a spreadsheet I made showing pretty much all the ones on Wikipedia plus some, and describing some adpositions they correspond to, and a vague rarity based on how many examples of each are listed on Wikipedia. Of course, take this with a massive, massive grain of salt, as that's by no means a comprehensive measure of rarity. However, I was kind of starved on data there, as Walls doesn't carry data on individual cases, and I don't know of any other place that would. And plus, these probably wouldn't have data on many of these extremely rare, unique cases. Do note that, as mentioned, the dative sometimes takes on a directional meaning, with its association with the adposition to, and the classical meaning of the ablative is from, so not all local cases are variants of the locative. Also, in languages that do have many local cases, the locative likely won't exist as its meaning is spread across other cases, but the ablative and dative usually aren't lost in these situations. The locative, notably, is often used alongside other adpositions, and may even transition into the aforementioned prepositional case because of this. Next, we have the ablative, which, as mentioned, is comparable to the adposition from, and occasionally takes the genitives use as the general relation case, meaning something like concerning. The ablative also may be repurposed for things such as comparison, like in Armenian and Manchu, meaning something like than, or to express the agent of a passive statement as mentioned, like in Armenian. Then, last of the core cases, we have the instrumental, which represents the semantic role of instrument. It's the with in she hit the nail with a hammer. Notably, it is very often merged with the comitative, which I'll get into in a sec. And in fact, both meanings are expressed through the English with. Very uniquely and interestingly, in Inuktitut, the role of instrument is actually expressed by the absolutive case, assumably along with the usual indication of the S and O arguments. Although it's kind of unclear how that actually works. Maybe it's a similar principle to the indirect object, where it gets its own syntactic slot? If you speak Inuktitut, please let me know. Now, let's get into some non-core cases. By the end of this, I should have listed all or almost all of the non-morphosyntactic cases on Wikipedia, with at least 2 listed examples. If I'm missing one, it might be for a solid reason, or I could have just missed it. First, one of the most common non-core cases, the comitative. The comitative case describes something accompanying something else, like with the dog with a tie. It is also notably used on genitives more often than obliques. It can sometimes be split further or restricted to the associative and or ornative, such as in Hungarian, with associative being like along with, usually involving a literal person accompanying another, like in the child walked with her mother, and the ornative being like equipped with, and describing an item someone has with them, like with the previous the dog with the tie example. There's also notably the fairly common privative or abessive case, which is sort of like an anti-comitative case, meaning something like without. Next up, something that isn't case, but I felt like I should shove in this video. Sometimes, in languages that have extensive topic marking, and also have case, the language might also treat the topic marking like a case. Which makes sense, because topicalizing phrases are often marked off with an adposition, meaning something like as for or concerning, and are generally grammatically a type of adpositional phrase. However, this is extremely rare, and this type of topic marking isn't considered case because it indicates pragmatic role, but doesn't give any more insight into the semantic meaning or role of its argument. The only real strong example I could find of the connection being confirmed is with Japanese's aforementioned case particles. It has an agentive, patientive, and topical particle, along with other particles for some other cases. And the topic particle is grammatically treated pretty much identically as other case particles, and is always listed with them. I could have sworn, though, that I had seen another example, but I haven't been able to find it. So, if you find another language that treats topic marking and case marking the same, please comment below. There are some languages, like Turkish, that contain both case and topic marking, but they don't treat them the same. And some, like Quechua and Mongolian, where the topic affixes aren't listed under case, but grammatically they may be similar. Then there are the state cases, which are really weird. And often, if you have one, you have others, like with the local cases. They also notably often carry adverbial meanings, and are sometimes considered more as derivational strategies for adverbs rather than full cases, although usually it's accepted that both can be true at once. And I don't really know how to solidly describe them as a group, so I'll just list. There's the essive or adverbial case, which sort of means something like like in as a child I love reading, or I'm as happy as a clam. This may seem strange to get its own case, but languages that have this and other stative cases often phrase sentences in ways that seem weird to us, but more directly utilize these cases. For example, instead of saying I am a composer, you might say I act as a composer. Or instead of I speak German, you might say I speak as a German. There's the comparative case, which marks comparison, similar in meaning to like or than, depending on context. He is like a dog, or he is faster than the dog. This case's meaning is also notably often subsumed into the essive case. There's the equative case, which specifically marks the like similarity between two things, sort of being a subcase of the comparative, although it is notably more common than its broader counterpart. Then there are the excessive and translative cases, which mark transformation of condition from and to certain states respectively, sometimes approximated as turning from and turning into or becoming, such as in she went from a nurse to a doctor, or the star died, becoming a black hole. The excessive case used to be a thing in Estonian and Finnish, but barely is, if at all, now, while the transitive is a fair bit more common and is still found in both of those languages and more. Now, let's speed around some others. Vocative. This is probably the most common non-core case by far, and it refers to the addressee of a sentence, like in John walked the dog. In English, it used to be marked by the particle o, and similarly, in other languages, it's often marked by an interjection, or the second-person pronoun you, affixing onto the word instead of an adposition, which could lead to unique morphology. Partative. This is used for amounts out of a total, like in 3 of the dogs escaped. Instructive. This means something like by means of, and can be used for any answer to the question how, really, like in she won the game by cheating. Distributive. This means something like per or each, like in each house had a different color, or they were given 1 key per house. Temporal. This describes something occurring at a specific time, like on Sunday or at 7. Distributive-Temporal. This is distributive when applied to time, meaning something like every or each, and every winter or each spring, or like the suffix "ly" and monthly or daily. Aversive. This means something like avoiding. She crossed the street, avoiding the creepy house. Causal. This means something like because of, and I lost because of him. It relates to, but is different from the more general causal adverbial clauses, because it refers to a single noun phrase as a cause instead of a more complex reason expressed in a clause, like I lost because he cheated. And lastly, Causal-Final. The name is a bit misleading because this case more so describes for the purpose of, like in he stole for a loaf of bread. I guess the logic is that the bread caused the stealing. I don't know, the name's weird. Okay, there's still more to talk about though, but I'll make it quick. There's quirky subject and differential argument marking. Hindi notably has both. Quirky subject is where the grammatical subject is in a case other than the nominative or absolutive. This has a close relation to the active state of alignment, because the mechanics of that alignment usually rely on the subject switching cases based on the verb or its agent or patient-like behavior. The most common form of this is the dative subject, often being used as the subject of verbs of emotion, kind of like saying for/to me, love at/of you is had, instead of I love you. Georgian is a split S active stative language and notably has 4 classes. 1 normal transitive, 1 agent-like intransitive, 1 patient-like intransitive, and 1 class that uses this quirky subject structure with a dative subject. Icelandic is known for going crazy with quirky subject, supposedly having all of its cases being able to be used as the subject in certain situations. As for differential argument marking, it is when sometimes an argument takes a case and sometimes it doesn't, usually based on animacy, definiteness, and/or topicality, with the more prominent, i.e. animate, definite, and topical arguments, being marked with their usual case, the less ones usually being put in a default unmarked case, i.e. the nominative or absolutive. This process is by far most common with grammatical objects, very rarely occurring in subjects or obliques. Interestingly, due to the fact that this differential marking can sometimes be based on definiteness, Sometimes, like with Turkish objects, instead of definiteness being marked on its own, it is shown based on whether the noun has case marking. Also, interestingly, Spanish and Persian mark their prominent objects with adpositions instead of morphological case, mayhaps suggesting a possible route by which you could develop a case system. And that should be all for this video. But before I go, oh my god, you guys. Thank you so much for 100 subscribers. Morphosyntactic alignment was perhaps the video I've been most excited to make so far. I'm glad y'all really liked it. If you look at my subscriber count over time, you can see how I gained about 50 subscribers around my welcome video and Phonology 1 video, but then slowly climbed up over time, gaining a few subscribers each upload, until settling at about 68 before I uploaded Morphosyntactic alignment. But then, pretty dang soon after I uploaded, I got a crazy bump, and only 3 days after uploading on January 5th, I reached 100. And as of recording, I'm now at 129 subscribers. A 61 subscriber bump up. I know the algorithm picked up my last video, so let's see how many I gained from this one. Grammatical Case was probably next on my list of most exciting videos to make. The numbers going up and the comments I get really mean a lot to me and motivate me to make more videos better and faster. So if you enjoy, please do the whole like, subscribe, comment bit. Thanks for watching.